Tonight, we journey back more than 2,000 years to a place unlike any the ancient world had ever seen. A place where scholars traveled across continents, where priceless scrolls filled endless shelves, and where humanity dreamed of gathering all knowledge beneath a single roof. It was more than a library. It was a symbol of curiosity, discovery, and the endless pursuit of wisdom. Yet somewhere in history, this extraordinary place vanished, leaving behind one of the greatest mysteries ever told. Was it destroyed in a single catastrophic fire, or did it slowly disappear over centuries? Before we uncover the truth, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy relaxing journeys through history. Now dim the lights, settle into a comfortable position, and let your imagination carry you to the ancient city of Alexandria, where the greatest treasure was not gold or jewels, but knowledge itself. This is the true story of the Library of Alexandria. For thousands of years, the greatest treasures in the world were measured in gold, silver, precious stones, and fertile land. Kings fought wars to expand their borders. Merchants crossed dangerous seas in search of wealth, and powerful rulers built magnificent palaces to display their greatness. But more than 2,000 years ago, in a city beside the Mediterranean Sea, an extraordinary dream began to take shape. It was a dream unlike any the ancient world had ever imagined. Instead of collecting riches, one kingdom set out to collect knowledge, not the knowledge of one nation, one language, or one people, but the knowledge of the entire known world. That dream became the Library of Alexandria. Today, the Library of Alexandria is remembered as the greatest library of the ancient world, a place so legendary that it has become almost mythical. People often imagine endless halls filled with countless scrolls, brilliant philosophers debating profound ideas, mathematicians solving impossible problems, physicians studying the human body, and astronomers mapping the heavens. Yet behind these familiar images lies a far more fascinating story. The Library of Alexandria was not simply a building filled with books. It was humanity's first great attempt to preserve every important idea ever written. In many ways, it was the closest thing the ancient world ever created to a universal memory. Long before computers, long before printing presses, and long before the internet connected billions of people, the people of Alexandria believed that knowledge itself could unite civilizations. Every scroll represented a voice from another place. Every manuscript carried the experience of another culture. Every new discovery expanded humanity's understanding of the world. The library was built upon a simple but revolutionary belief that knowledge should not remain isolated. It should be gathered, protected, copied, studied, and shared. To us, this may seem obvious. Today, we can search for information within seconds, using devices that fit inside our pockets. Entire libraries now exist in digital form. Millions of books can be stored on machines no larger than a notebook. But in the 3rd century before Christ, preserving knowledge was one of the greatest challenges humanity had ever faced. Every book had to be copied entirely by hand. Every mistake made by a scribe could alter the meaning of a text forever. A single fire, flood, war, or careless ruler could erase generations of wisdom in a matter of hours. Knowledge was fragile because it lived on papyrus, ink, and human memory. And yet, despite those challenges, the people of Alexandria believed that preserving knowledge was worth every effort. They invested enormous wealth not in larger armies, but in scholars. They welcomed mathematicians instead of conquerors, philosophers instead of generals, physicians instead of warriors. Their greatest ambition was not to build the tallest monument, but to create the greatest center of learning the world had ever known. Looking back today, that ambition seems almost impossible. How could one city hope to gather every important scroll from every civilization? How could a single library preserve the thoughts of millions of people spread across continents? The answer begins with one of history's most extraordinary cities, a city created by one of history's most extraordinary men. No one living in Alexandria could have imagined that they were witnessing the beginning of one of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements. The city would soon become a beacon for scholars from every corner of the known world, attracting minds whose discoveries would shape mathematics, astronomy, medicine, geography, and philosophy for centuries to come. But before the first scroll ever reached its shelves, another remarkable story had to unfold. The story of the man whose vision gave birth to the city itself. And like many of history's greatest dreams, it all began with a single ambition that seemed impossible. To understand why the Library of Alexandria came into existence, we must first understand the remarkable city that gave it its name. That story begins with one of history's most famous conquerors, Alexander the Great. In 331 BC, after a series of astonishing military victories, Alexander arrived on the northern coast of Egypt. Unlike many rulers before him, he did not simply occupy the land. He envisioned something far greater. Standing beside the calm waters of the Mediterranean, he chose the location for a brand new city that would connect Africa, Asia, and Europe. It was a place where merchants, sailors, scholars, and travelers from every corner of the known world could meet. He named the city after himself, Alexandria. Although Alexander dreamed of making the city a shining center of culture and commerce, he would never live to see it completed. Only a few years later, at the age of just 32, he died unexpectedly in Babylon, leaving behind one of the largest empires the world had ever known. His death created uncertainty across the empire as his generals struggled to divide his vast territories among themselves. Egypt eventually came under the rule of one of Alexander's most trusted commanders, Ptolemy. Unlike many rulers who focused only on military power, Ptolemy understood that lasting greatness required more than strong armies. Wealth could be stolen, kingdoms could fall, and monuments could crumble, but knowledge had the power to outlive generations. Inspired by Alexander's vision of a city that would unite civilizations, Ptolemy imagined Alexandria becoming something even greater, the intellectual capital of the ancient world. It would not merely be a prosperous port filled with ships and merchants. It would become the place where the brightest minds gathered to ask questions that no one else had dared to ask. Under the Ptolemaic dynasty, enormous resources were devoted to transforming Alexandria into the greatest center of learning on earth. Magnificent palaces rose beside the harbor. Wide marble streets connected temples, marketplaces, and government buildings. Engineers designed impressive ports capable of welcoming hundreds of ships each year. Towering above the coastline stood the famous Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guiding sailors safely across the Mediterranean. But hidden behind these visible achievements was an even more ambitious project. Deep within the royal district, Plans were taking shape for an institution unlike anything humanity had ever attempted before. This would not simply be a room filled with scrolls. It would become a living center of discovery where scholars could study together, debate freely, conduct research, translate foreign texts, and preserve the wisdom of countless civilizations under one roof. The rulers of Alexandria believed that every scroll contained a fragment of humanity's story, and if enough of those fragments could be gathered together, perhaps the entire story of civilization itself could finally be understood. It was an extraordinary idea, one that had never before been attempted on such a scale. No kingdom had ever set out to collect the written knowledge of the entire known world. Yet Alexandria was about to do exactly that. Soon ships arriving from distant shores would carry something more valuable than gold, spices, or precious jewels. They would carry ideas, discoveries, poems, histories, and dreams written upon fragile rolls of papyrus. Without realizing it, the ancient world was about to begin one of the greatest intellectual adventures in human history. As the construction of the Library of Alexandria continued, its rulers faced an extraordinary challenge. Building magnificent halls of marble and cedar was only the beginning. Empty shelves could never fulfill their ambitious dream. A library could only become great if it contained great knowledge, and that knowledge was scattered across thousands of miles, preserved by countless civilizations speaking different languages and recording their histories in very different ways. The rulers of Alexandria therefore launched one of the most ambitious collecting missions in human history. Their goal was astonishingly simple to describe, yet almost impossible to achieve: to gather every important written work that existed throughout the known world. Messengers, scholars, merchants, and royal agents traveled across Egypt, Greece, Asia Minor, Phoenicia, Persia, and beyond, searching for scrolls wherever they could be found. Temples, royal archives, private collections, schools, marketplaces, and ports all became sources of new knowledge. Every successful journey brought another small piece of humanity's story back to Alexandria. Some scrolls contained epic poems passed down through generations. Others preserved scientific observations, medical treatments, engineering techniques, religious traditions, mathematical discoveries, or detailed histories of distant kingdoms. To the librarians of Alexandria, every manuscript possessed value because every civilization had something worth preserving. One of the library's most remarkable policies became legendary throughout the ancient Mediterranean. Whenever a merchant ship entered the harbor of Alexandria, royal officials carefully inspected its cargo. If books or scrolls were discovered on board, they were respectfully taken to the library, where teams of highly skilled scribes immediately began making exact copies. Once the copying was complete, the duplicate was usually returned to the ship, while the original manuscript remained safely inside the library's growing collection. Whether every story about this practice is entirely accurate remains uncertain, but ancient historians agree that the rulers of Alexandria spared little expense in expanding their library. They purchased rare manuscripts for enormous sums of money, borrowed famous works from distant cities, and sometimes negotiated with foreign rulers simply to obtain valuable texts. The desire to collect knowledge became almost as important as collecting territory had once been for great empires. Inside the library, another remarkable task had begun. Scholars worked tirelessly to translate manuscripts into Greek, allowing ideas from different cultures to be understood by far more people than ever before. Egyptian wisdom, Babylonian astronomy, Persian records, and writings from many other civilizations could now be studied side by side. Translation was more than changing words from one language into another. It required understanding unfamiliar customs, beliefs, measurements, and ideas. A careless translation could completely alter the meaning of an author's work, so the library employed some of the finest scholars of the ancient world to ensure the greatest possible accuracy. Day after day, the scratching of reed pens echoed through the halls. A scribe copied manuscripts with extraordinary patience. Every completed scroll represented another victory against forgetting. Every carefully preserved text became another voice rescued from silence. Without realizing it, the librarians of Alexandria were attempting something humanity had never attempted before: to protect civilization's collective memory from being lost to time itself. Over time, the collection grew beyond anything most people believed possible. Shelves that had once stood empty gradually filled with voices from distant lands, each scroll carrying the thoughts of another generation. Walking through the library became like traveling across the ancient world itself, where every corridor offered a new language, a new culture, and another piece of humanity's shared story. As the collection continued to grow, the Library of Alexandria became something the ancient world had never seen before. It was no longer simply a place where scrolls were stored. It became a living center of learning where knowledge was constantly being questioned, refined, expanded, and shared. Every day, the library welcomed scholars from different civilizations, each bringing unique traditions, languages, and ways of understanding the world. For perhaps the first time in history, ideas from Egypt, Greece, Persia, Babylon, Phoenicia, and many other cultures existed side by side under one roof. The library encouraged something rare in the ancient world: not simply preserving knowledge, but allowing different ideas to meet each other. A mathematician could spend the morning discussing geometry with a philosopher before listening to an astronomer explain the movements of the stars. Physicians compared medical treatments recorded by Egyptian healers with observations brought from Greece and Asia. Historians examined royal records from distant kingdoms, while geographers studied reports carried home by sailors who had traveled farther than most people could ever imagine. Every conversation had the potential to inspire another discovery. Every translated manuscript opened a new window into another civilization. Within these walls, curiosity became the common language that united people who otherwise shared little in common. Some of history's greatest minds either studied, taught, or conducted research in Alexandria. Euclid organized the principles of geometry into a system that is still taught in schools more than 2,000 years later. Eratosthenes accomplished what many believed impossible by calculating the circumference of the Earth with astonishing accuracy, using only shadows, simple measurements, and mathematics. Aristarchus proposed that the Earth might travel around the Sun rather than the other way around, an idea centuries ahead of its time. Physicians carefully studied anatomy, engineers designed remarkable machines, and poets composed works that would influence literature for generations. These extraordinary achievements were possible because the library offered something almost unheard of in the ancient world? Time to think. Scholars received financial support, comfortable housing, meals, and access to an unmatched collection of manuscripts, allowing them to dedicate their lives entirely to learning rather than survival. It was an environment where questions were valued as much as answers, and where the pursuit of knowledge itself became a noble purpose. Yet beneath all of this greatness existed a hidden weakness that few people truly appreciated. Every poem, scientific observation, map, medical record, philosophical argument, and historical account depended upon fragile rolls of papyrus. Unlike monuments carved into stone, these priceless manuscripts could be damaged by moisture, insects, neglect, or a single careless spark. The greatest collection of knowledge ever assembled rested upon one of the most delicate materials available to the ancient world. As the library reached the height of its influence, almost no one imagined that its greatest enemy would not be ignorance, but time, conflict, and the unpredictable course of history itself. The shelves seemed endless, the halls eternal, and the future secure. But history has a way of reminding even the greatest civilizations that nothing built by human hands lasts forever. Long before the flames of legend became part of its story, the fate of the Library of Alexandria had already begun to unfold in ways no scholar could possibly foresee. For all its greatness, the Library of Alexandria was never intended to be a quiet warehouse where scrolls gathered dust. From the very beginning, it was designed to be a place where knowledge remained alive. Every corridor echoed with conversation, every reading room with careful debate, and every desk with the gentle scratching of reed pens across fresh papyrus. Scholars did not simply read the works of earlier generations. They challenged them, corrected them, expanded upon them, and sometimes completely changed the way people understood the world. In many ways, the library functioned more like a modern university than the libraries we know today. It was a place where questions mattered just as much as answers. Each morning, as sunlight entered through high marble windows, the halls slowly filled with philosophers, physicians, mathematicians, astronomers, poets, historians, and engineers. Some had traveled hundreds or even thousands of miles simply to study within its walls. Others had been invited personally by the rulers of Egypt, who believed that attracting brilliant minds was one of the greatest investments a kingdom could make. Meals, housing, and financial support were often provided so scholars could dedicate themselves entirely to learning without worrying about earning a living. This freedom allowed ideas to develop over years rather than days, creating an atmosphere unlike anywhere else in the ancient world. One room might contain physicians discussing the structure of the human body, while nearby astronomers carefully compared observations of the stars recorded by Babylonian priests generations earlier. In another hall, mathematicians debated geometric proofs, while geographers spread enormous maps across wooden tables, attempting to describe lands few people had ever seen. Everywhere, knowledge crossed boundaries. Language was no longer a barrier, but a bridge. Greek scholars learned from Egyptian priests, Egyptian scholars studied Babylonian astronomy, and translators worked tirelessly to ensure that ideas from one civilization could be understood by another. Every successful translation represented more than words transferred from one language into another. It represented an entire culture becoming accessible to people who had never encountered it before. The library became a meeting place, not only for books, but for civilizations themselves. Among its greatest achievements was the famous translation of the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek, a work known today as the Septuagint. According to tradition, dozens of scholars worked carefully to produce a translation that could be read throughout the Greek-speaking world. Whether every detail of that story is historically accurate remains debated, but it illustrates the extraordinary importance Alexandria placed upon making knowledge available beyond the borders of a single language. The library believed that wisdom should travel freely, just as ships crossed the Mediterranean carrying goods from distant lands. This spirit of openness transformed Alexandria into the intellectual heart of the ancient world. Travelers often returned home carrying not only merchandise, but entirely new ideas. Mathematics, medicine, philosophy, engineering, literature, and geography all grew stronger because scholars were no longer working in isolation. They were learning from one another every single day. Looking back across more than 2,000 years, it is difficult to overstate how revolutionary this was. In an age when most people never traveled far from the place they were born, Alexandria became a crossroads where the knowledge of continents quietly came together beneath a single roof. Visitors often described Alexandria as a city where curiosity seemed as valuable as wealth itself. A single conversation inside the library could introduce a scholar to ideas that had traveled thousands of miles across deserts and seas before finally reaching its shelves. For a brief moment in history, it truly seemed possible that humanity might preserve all of its knowledge in one extraordinary place, ensuring that the wisdom of the past would continue guiding the generations yet to come. It was an experiment in shared human understanding, unlike anything history had ever witnessed before. Yet history has often shown that humanity's greatest achievements are also its most fragile. While the scholars of Alexandria devoted themselves to protecting knowledge from being forgotten, forces beyond the library's walls were already beginning to shape a future that none of them could possibly foresee. For centuries, people have imagined the Library of Alexandria disappearing in a single night, consumed by towering flames that swallowed the greatest collection of knowledge the ancient world had ever assembled. It is a powerful image, one that has appeared in paintings, novels, documentaries, and popular culture for generations. A magnificent library, endless shelves of priceless scrolls, a sky glowing red above Alexandria as knowledge itself seemed to burn. Yet history is rarely as simple as legend. The more historians have studied the Library of Alexandria, the more complicated its story has become. Surprisingly, no ancient eyewitness ever left behind a detailed account describing the complete destruction of the library in one single catastrophic event. Instead, the surviving evidence suggests something far more mysterious. Rather than disappearing in a single dramatic night, the library may have declined slowly over centuries, suffering one setback after another until little remained. This possibility has fascinated historians for generations because it transforms the story from a single tragedy into a long sequence of political conflict, changing rulers, religious transformation, economic decline, and simple neglect. One of the earliest events connected with the library occurred in 48 BC, when Julius Caesar became involved in a civil war in Egypt. During the fighting around Alexandria's harbor, fires broke out among the ships. Ancient writers later claimed that those flames spread into nearby buildings, damaging warehouses that contained large numbers of scrolls. Some historians believe this accident may have destroyed part of the library's collection. Others argue that the famous library itself survived largely intact. The ancient sources do not completely agree, leaving modern researchers with more questions than answers. Even after Caesar's campaign, scholars continued working in Alexandria for many years. Historical records mention philosophers, teachers, and researchers still active within the city, suggesting that at least part of the institution remained alive. This raises an important question. If the library truly survived Caesar's fire, what eventually happened to it? As centuries passed, Alexandria experienced repeated periods of instability. Wars, invasions, political struggles, and economic difficulties gradually weakened many of the institutions that had once made the city famous. The library depended upon royal support, generous funding, skilled scribes, and a continuous effort to preserve fragile manuscripts. Once that support began to disappear, maintaining such an enormous collection became increasingly difficult. Scrolls naturally deteriorated with age. Papyrus could be damaged by humidity, insects, mold, and careless handling. Every manuscript required constant attention simply to survive. A library of hundreds of thousands of scrolls demanded an extraordinary amount of work every single day. If fewer scholars copied aging texts, knowledge could quietly vanish without a single fire ever taking place. This possibility reminds us that history is not always lost through spectacular disasters. Sometimes it disappears little by little, one neglected manuscript at a time. The greatest danger to knowledge is not always destruction. Sometimes it is simply forgetting. If the Library of Alexandria did not vanish in a single catastrophic fire, then what truly brought about its end? It is a question that has challenged historians for centuries. And despite countless books, archaeological discoveries, and historical investigations, no single answer has ever satisfied everyone. Instead, the evidence suggests that the library's fate unfolded slowly, shaped by generations of political change rather than one unforgettable night. Every new ruler who controlled Alexandria inherited not only its magnificent buildings, but also the responsibility of maintaining one of the most ambitious intellectual institutions ever created. Some valued that responsibility, others did not. As power shifted from the Ptolemaic dynasty to Roman rule, priorities gradually changed. The city remained prosperous, and scholars continued their work for many years. But the generous royal support that had once sustained the library was no longer guaranteed. Funding became less certain. Fewer scribes were available to copy aging manuscripts. Buildings required constant maintenance, and preserving hundreds of thousands of fragile papyrus scrolls demanded enormous resources. Every generation faced the same challenge, protecting the wisdom of the past before time quietly erased it. Unlike modern books printed in thousands of identical copies, each ancient manuscript was unique. If a scroll became damaged and no one created another copy, its knowledge could disappear forever. Every passing decade, therefore, became a race against decay. Papyrus naturally weakened with age. Ink slowly faded. Humidity, insects, mold, and simple handling gradually wore away the delicate material. Librarians fought a silent battle every day, preserving not only objects, but entire ideas that existed nowhere else on Earth. Then came another profound transformation. During the 4th century AD, The Roman Empire experienced enormous religious and political change as Christianity gradually became the empire's dominant faith. Many ancient temples lost their traditional role within society, and institutions closely connected with older religious traditions often struggled to survive. Alexandria itself became a city of passionate debate, where different beliefs sometimes existed peacefully and at other times clashed with remarkable intensity. Historians continue to debate exactly how these changes affected the Library of Alexandria, because the surviving evidence remains incomplete. Some ancient writers suggest that parts of the great scholarly complex suffered during periods of religious conflict, while others believe much of the library had already declined long before these events occurred. What seems increasingly likely is that there was no single moment when someone could point to the library and say, "Today it has disappeared." Instead, generation after generation witnessed a little less of its former greatness. A damaged scroll here, an abandoned reading room there, a scholar who never arrived to replace another, a manuscript that quietly crumbled before anyone thought to copy it. The loss was gradual, almost invisible, until one day people began speaking of the Library of Alexandria not as a living institution, but as a memory. The tragedy was so gradual that many people living in Alexandria may never have realized they were witnessing the disappearance of one of history's greatest achievements. A scholar visiting the library one generation might simply notice that a familiar collection had become smaller, while another might discover that an aging manuscript could no longer be found on its usual shelf. No dramatic announcement marked its decline. Instead, the world's greatest treasury of knowledge faded quietly, almost unnoticed, until later generations could only wonder what had once existed within those silent walls. Perhaps that is what makes its story so haunting. Humanity did not simply lose a building. It slowly lost one conversation after another, one discovery after another, one voice after another, until silence eventually replaced the endless exchange of ideas that had once filled its magnificent halls. As the centuries passed, the Library of Alexandria slowly disappeared from the physical world, but it grew larger than ever in human memory. Long after its reading halls had fallen silent, people continued telling stories about the greatest library that had ever existed. Travelers spoke of endless shelves stretching farther than the eye could see. Scholars imagined rooms filled with forgotten masterpieces that no one would ever read again. Writers described priceless scrolls consumed by flames, transforming the library into a symbol of everything humanity fears losing. Over time, history and legend became so closely intertwined that separating one from the other became almost impossible. Every generation added another layer to the story, each attempting to explain how such an extraordinary achievement could simply vanish. Some blamed Julius Caesar. Others believed religious conflict brought about its destruction. Centuries later, another tradition claimed that the Arab conquest of Alexandria finally ended the library forever. Yet, when historians carefully compare the surviving evidence, none of these explanations provides a complete answer. Ancient sources often contradict one another. Later writers sometimes repeated stories without verifying them, and many original records have themselves been lost to history. Ironically, even our knowledge about the library's disappearance has become another example of knowledge that faded with time. Perhaps this uncertainty explains why the Library of Alexandria continues to fascinate people today. We are not only searching for a building that disappeared, we are searching for answers that may never be fully recovered. Every lost scroll invites another question. Every missing manuscript encourages another theory. The mystery itself has become part of the library's legacy. Historians often remind us that the greatest loss may not have been the building itself, but the countless works that disappeared with it. We know that many ancient authors wrote books that no longer exist. Some survive only because later writers briefly mentioned their titles. Others vanish so completely that we do not even know what subjects they explored. Entire philosophies, scientific observations, poems, dramas, historical accounts, and discoveries may have been lost forever. We can only imagine what those forgotten pages contained. Perhaps there were medical ideas centuries ahead of their time. Perhaps there were detailed histories of civilizations now almost entirely forgotten. Perhaps there were observations of the stars, maps of distant lands, or works of literature unlike anything that has survived to the present day. The silence left behind by those missing scrolls is one of history's greatest mysteries. And yet, despite everything that disappeared, the Library of Alexandria was not a failure. Quite the opposite. Its influence survived long after its walls had fallen. The belief that knowledge should be collected, preserved, translated, shared, and protected inspired libraries across the ancient, medieval, and modern worlds. Every university library, every national archive, every museum preserving fragile manuscripts, and every digital collection preserving human knowledge today carries a small part of Alexandria's original dream. In that sense, the library never truly vanished. Its shelves may have disappeared, its scrolls may have been scattered, and its halls may have become silent. But its greatest idea continues to live wherever people believe that knowledge belongs to all humanity. Perhaps that is the true legacy of Alexandria. Buildings may fall, empires may disappear, and civilizations may fade into history, but the human desire to learn, to preserve, and to pass knowledge forward has survived every fire, every war, and every century. In many ways, that dream is still alive today, waiting quietly on the shelves of every library we enter. By the time the Library of Alexandria reached its greatest size, it had become far more than a collection of scrolls. It was one of the largest centers of learning the ancient world had ever known. Although historians still debate the exact number, many believe its collection eventually grew to several 100,000 papyrus scrolls. These manuscripts arrived from every corner of the Mediterranean and the Near East, carrying the knowledge of civilizations that had developed over thousands of years. Some contained poetry and literature, others described mathematics, astronomy, medicine, engineering, philosophy, geography, religion, law, or history. The rulers of Alexandria wanted every important work they could find, regardless of where it had been written or which language it originally used. As the collection expanded, keeping everything organized became an enormous challenge. A library containing hundreds of thousands of scrolls could easily become impossible to navigate unless every manuscript had its proper place. To solve this problem, one of the library's scholars, Callimachus, created what many historians consider to be the world's first large-scale library catalogue. His work, known as the Pinakes, listed authors, subjects, and titles, allowing scholars to locate manuscripts without searching every shelf individually. Although the Pinakis itself has not survived, later writers described it as an extraordinary achievement that transformed the way libraries were organized. The collection itself was divided into subjects so that scholars studying similar ideas could easily find related works. Philosophy, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, poetry, drama, history, and many other fields were kept together in carefully arranged sections. This system made it possible for researchers to compare different authors, study earlier discoveries, and continue expanding human knowledge instead of beginning again from nothing. Every scroll represented years of careful work. Before paper became common, most books were written on long sheets of papyrus, made from reeds growing along the Nile River. After the writing was completed, each sheet was rolled around a wooden rod and tied with a small cord. Small tags attached to the outside identified the title or the author's name, making it easier to recognize each manuscript while it remained on the shelf. Even with this system, maintaining such a collection required constant attention. Papyrus gradually became brittle as it aged, especially if exposed to humidity or frequent handling. Librarians regularly inspected older manuscripts, replacing damaged copies with newly written versions before the originals became unreadable. Teams of skilled scribes spent countless hours copying texts by hand, one line after another, preserving works that otherwise might have disappeared forever. It was slow, demanding work, but it ensured that valuable knowledge could survive from one generation to the next. Day after day, without attracting attention, these scribes quietly became some of the most important guardians of human history. While kings ruled kingdoms and generals commanded armies, the people working inside the Library of Alexandria were protecting something far more enduring: the written memory of civilization itself. Among the hundreds of thousands of scrolls preserved inside the Library of Alexandria were some of the most important works ever written in the ancient world. The poems of Homer were carefully copied and studied by generations of scholars. The philosophical writings of Plato and Aristotle attracted students eager to understand questions about ethics, politics, nature, and the human mind. Histories written by Herodotus and Thucydides allowed readers to explore the rise and fall of kingdoms long before their own time. Physicians consulted the medical knowledge of Hippocrates, while mathematicians built upon the geometric principles that would later be organized by Euclid. Every shelf represented centuries of human thought, collected from civilizations separated by great distances, but united within the walls of a single library. The collection continued to grow as new discoveries were made. Astronomers added observations of the stars and planets. Geographers updated maps using reports brought by sailors and explorers, and engineers recorded inventions designed to solve practical problems. Poets and playwrights contributed new works alongside ancient classics, allowing the library to preserve not only the past, but also the achievements of its own time. Knowledge inside Alexandria was never static. It continued expanding with every generation that contributed another scroll to its shelves. Some scholars believe that many works, now considered completely lost, may once have rested inside the library. We know that dozens of plays written by Sophocles and Euripides have disappeared. Hundreds of books mentioned by ancient writers are no longer known to exist. Entire schools of philosophy survive only through fragments quoted by later authors. histories describing distant kingdoms, scientific observations, early maps, and literary masterpieces may all have been stored in Alexandria before gradually disappearing from history. Because so few original manuscripts survived, historians can only estimate what may have been lost. This uncertainty has inspired endless curiosity for centuries. Every archaeological discovery raises new questions. Every newly translated inscription provides another small clue. Yet many mysteries remain unsolved. Historians continue searching not because they expect to recover every lost scroll, but because each new discovery helps us better understand the remarkable world that once surrounded the library. The greatest achievement of Alexandria was never simply the number of books it possessed. Its greatest achievement was bringing together knowledge from civilizations that rarely communicated directly with one another. Egyptian priests, Greek philosophers, Babylonian astronomers, Persian scholars, Phoenician merchants, and travelers from distant lands all contributed pieces of a much larger picture. The library became a place where ideas crossed borders more easily than armies. Long before the modern world spoke about international cooperation, Alexandria quietly demonstrated that knowledge grows stronger when it is shared. Although the shelves eventually disappeared, that lesson survived. Every great library built afterward inherited a small part of Alexandria's original purpose. Every researcher who studies earlier discoveries before making a new one continues a tradition that began more than 2,000 years ago beside the Mediterranean Sea. In that sense, the Library of Alexandria never truly belonged to Egypt alone. It belonged to everyone who believed that preserving knowledge was one of humanity's greatest responsibilities, and that belief continues to shape our world even today. Although the original Library of Alexandria disappeared many centuries ago, the search for its story has never truly ended. Historians, archaeologists, and scholars continue trying to answer the same questions that have fascinated people for generations. Where exactly did the library stand? How much of its collection really survived through the centuries? And perhaps the most intriguing question of all, could any part of its lost knowledge still remain undiscovered? Modern archaeology has revealed much about ancient Alexandria, but the city itself presents an enormous challenge. Over more than 2,000 years, earthquakes, rising sea levels, and repeated rebuilding have transformed the landscape. Parts of ancient Alexandria now lie beneath the modern city, while other sections rest beneath the waters of the Mediterranean Sea. Excavations have uncovered streets, temples, statues, palaces, and sections of the royal quarter, where many historians believe the Great Library and its associated institutions once stood. Yet despite decades of careful research, no archaeologist has uncovered a single building that can be identified with complete certainty as the Library of Alexandria itself. Instead, historians piece together its story using fragments of evidence from many different sources. Ancient texts describe its organization. Later writers preserve references to its scholars, and archaeological discoveries help reconstruct the city where it once flourished. Like assembling an enormous puzzle with many missing pieces, each discovery adds another small detail while leaving other questions unanswered. Occasionally, remarkable discoveries remind us that history can still surprise us. Ancient papyrus scrolls continue to be found in Egypt, preserved by the country's dry climate. Other manuscripts have survived because they were copied repeatedly by generations of monks, scholars, and scribes long after the original library had disappeared. Without those careful copies, many of the works of Homer, Plato, Aristotle, and countless other ancient writers would almost certainly have been lost forever. In a way, the spirit of Alexandria survived through the people who continued copying and protecting knowledge across the centuries. The dream of preserving human knowledge also inspired a remarkable modern project. In 2002, not far from the location of the ancient library, the Biblioteca Alexandrina opened its doors to the world. Although it is not a reconstruction of the original building, it was created to honor the same vision that inspired the ancient library more than 2,000 years earlier. Today, it contains millions of books, research centers, museums, exhibitions, and reading halls welcoming visitors from around the world. It stands as a reminder that while buildings may disappear, ideas can endure far longer than stone. The modern library does not claim to replace what was lost. Instead, it celebrates the belief that knowledge should remain open to everyone, regardless of nationality, language, or culture. In many ways, it continues the conversation that began beside the Mediterranean Sea during the age of the Ptolemies. The original shelves may no longer exist, but the desire to collect, preserve, and share knowledge continues exactly as it did more than 20 centuries ago. Perhaps that is the closest humanity can come to rebuilding the Library of Alexandria, not by recreating its walls, but by keeping its purpose alive for generations still to come. The story of the Library of Alexandria is often remembered as the story of a great loss, yet perhaps it should also be remembered as the story of an extraordinary hope. More than 2,000 years ago, people living beside the Mediterranean believed that human knowledge was worth preserving, even if doing so demanded enormous effort, patience, and resources. They believed that ideas could outlive kingdoms, that wisdom could travel farther than armies, and that the discoveries of one generation could become the foundation for the next. It was an ambitious vision, and although the library itself did not survive the passing of centuries, that vision never truly disappeared. Every civilization since then has inherited a small part of the dream that began in Alexandria. Every library built to preserve books, every archive protecting fragile documents, every museum safeguarding the past, and every university dedicated to research continues the work that those ancient scholars once began. The tools have changed. Papyrus became parchment, parchment became paper, paper became digital archives, and today vast collections of knowledge can be stored within machines small enough to fit on a desk. Yet the purpose remains remarkably familiar. We continue collecting, preserving, organizing, and sharing knowledge because each generation understands that memory is one of civilization's greatest treasures. Looking back across history, it is remarkable how much of the ancient world has survived despite war, disaster, and the passing of time. Countless manuscripts disappeared forever, but countless others endured because someone chose to protect them. A careful scribe copied another manuscript before the original faded. A teacher passed a text to a student. A monastery preserved forgotten writings through the Middle Ages. A librarian carefully stored a fragile document where it could survive another century. History is often shaped not only by famous rulers and great battles, but also by quiet individuals whose names have been forgotten, while their work continues to influence millions of lives. The Library of Alexandria reminds us that preserving knowledge has always been a shared responsibility. No single generation can protect humanity's entire memory alone. Each generation simply holds it for a while before passing it forward. Perhaps that is why the library continues to inspire us after more than 2,000 years. It represents humanity at its very best, not seeking to conquer more land or accumulate greater wealth, but choosing instead to understand the world a little better than before. Although its shelves are gone, its greatest lesson remains. Knowledge grows when it is shared. Wisdom survives when it is preserved. Curiosity continues wherever people remain willing to ask questions. And as long as those ideas endure, a small part of the Library of Alexandria will continue to exist, not within marble walls or ancient scrolls, but within every person who believes that learning is one of humanity's greatest achievements. Its buildings may have vanished into history, but its purpose still lives quietly in every library we enter, every book we open, and every question we choose to ask. In that way, the greatest library of the ancient world never truly disappeared. It simply became part of the story of us all. Thank you for joining me on tonight's journey through history. If you enjoyed this peaceful exploration, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps this channel continue creating long, relaxing history documentaries designed to help you unwind, learn something new, and gently drift off to sleep. If there is another historical mystery or forgotten civilization you would like to explore in a future episode, feel free to share your suggestion in the comments below. I always enjoy reading your ideas. And now, wherever you are in the world, I hope you can leave behind the noise of the day, slow your thoughts, and enjoy a peaceful night's rest. Thank you for spending this time with me. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next journey through history. Good night.